You know, some of you are still waiting. You're still waiting, right? You're waiting for the right moment, maybe. Waiting to feel motivated. You're waiting for closure. You're waiting for someone to finally understand you enough to change your life. You probably are, right? Waiting for healing to somehow arrive without requiring you to be confrontational. And the hardest truth I've ever learned was this: nobody is coming to save you. Nobody's coming. No one is coming to heal you. No one's coming, right? And it's not because you're not worthy. It's not because you're not worthy. And it's not because nobody cares. But because eventually your life has to become your responsibility. It has to. And that realization, it either crushes people or it finally wakes them up. This is the Forge. Welcome back, guys, to the Forge. This is where we build something solid, right? We build something solid by talking about real stuff that nobody wants to talk about because they're all too afraid to talk about it, right? Today's episode is going to make some people uncomfortable, and I really hope it does, because this is really the truth in life, right? Good. Let it make you uncomfortable, because when you're uncomfortable, that's when things can change, right? Comfort is not always peace. Sometimes comfort is avoidance with just a little softer lighting, right? It really is. Today we're going to dive into what I call rescue fantasies, right? Rescue fantasies. It's this belief that, eventually someone's going to fix this for you. Eventually someone's going to understand you enough. Eventually someone's going to love you enough, motivate you enough, heal you enough. And, what happens when you realize, like, nobody can do your healing for you? They can't. No one can do this work for you. Not your therapist, not your partner, not your parents, not your friends. And don't misconstrue what I'm saying. Support matters deeply. It really matters. But no one can step into your nervous system and do this work for you. That just can't happen, right? That just cannot happen. And, human beings, us as humans, we naturally seek safety, right? We naturally do seek that. That's a very normal thing, and as children, when we were all little tykes, as children, survival literally depended on other people. It depended on caregivers. It depended on protection. It depended on emotional regulation. It depended on attachment, right? So our brains kind of developed this expectation, right? This expectation that kind of says, when I am distressed, someone will come help me regulate, right? And that's healthy in childhood. We want that. But for many adults, that pattern never really fully evolves. It really doesn't fully evolve into something else. And people spend years unconsciously waiting for, the perfect relationship, the perfect therapist, the perfect breakthrough moment, right? And they wait for the external thing, and that external thing will finally make internal change possible. And I understand why, right? Because responsibility is heavy. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Being responsible for ourselves, responsibility is heavy. It is really heavy, right? I mean, responsibility, um, Responsibility means there may not be a dramatic rescue moment, that just may not be there. There may not be closure in something. You may not receive closure. Your healing might be slow. Growth may be repetitive and really painful. And to be honest, these things can be terrifying to think of that, right? So instead of, you know, acknowledging these things, accepting these things as this could be part of my life where I'm not going to receive closure, right? My healing might be slow. Instead, we just kind of wait, right? We wait around like we're in some kind of lifeboat, hoping that, some big ship comes by and really just rescues us, and that's not always a good thing. That's not always a good thing. You know, I kind of want to talk about the brain for a minute. Surprise, surprise, right? What? Tyler wants to talk about the brain. Yes, I want to talk about the brain, right? There's some neuroscience here about waiting, right? The neuroscience of waiting. It's a real thing, and and again, let's talk about the brain here. There's a concept in psychology, and some of you may have heard it. It's called learned helplessness, right? Learned helplessness. So, there's this guy that I found some research on, Martin Seligman, big researcher, and he demonstrated that when organisms, things that live and function and have systems and things like that, when they repeatedly experience situations where effort does not change outcomes, right? Like no matter how much you try, nothing changes, they eventually stop trying, right? We eventually, as organisms, stop trying when our effort does not change outcomes. Even when escape becomes possible, right? And that escape that becomes possible, that matters deeply when we're talking about trauma, right? Because many people have histories where, speaking up didn't help. Boundaries weren't respected. Effort failed repeatedly, and pain felt unavoidable. It really felt unavoidable. So the nervous system really starts to adapt to some of these traumas, right? The brain learns that, hey, action doesn't really matter. Like, why bother, right? Um, and that becomes really like a neurological conditioning, right? It becomes a conditioning that we experience. So again, the prefrontal cortex in our brain, the part involved in planning and decision making and behavioral control, it starts losing its influence over our behavior during chronic stress, right? It starts to lose that influence and that power. So meanwhile, the amygdala becomes really hyperactive, like we've talked about before. The stress hormones will stay elevated, and avoidance behaviors become really reinforced, right? And here's really the important part to remember of this. Avoidance totally reduces anxiety temporarily, like it does. It works, man. Avoidance works. It works great. Um, and because avoidance reduces anxiety, our brain kind of rewards avoidance. And it's like, great job, man. Like, you really made me less stressed. I appreciate that. And this is how we start getting stuck, right? I do something that brings myself some good feelings, and then I get rewarded with a little bit of dopamine, right? And again, that's how we get stuck. It's not because we're lazy. It's because the nervous system learned that staying still feels safer than risking disappointment, right? And you've been rewarded from that over and over again. It's a vicious cycle. It really is a vicious cycle. Um, and so the addiction to potential, right? This is where things get really uncomfortable. Is some people become addicted to potential, not action, but potential, right? And when I think about potential, potential is kind of like, I don't know, potential can kind of be like this fantasy, right? This fantasy, right? This potential to have the best life, the potential to, I don't know, have the the best job, or the potential to have that certain group of friends that you kind of just fantasize about, right? So, you know, we become addicted to potential and not action. And so people that are kind of becoming addicted to potential, we're going to research endlessly, right? We're going to plan endlessly. We're going to journal endlessly, and we're going to consume self-help like endlessly. We're going to talk about healing endlessly, but never fully move. Why? Why is that? Because potential is emotionally safe, right? Nothing's changing. And I'm giving myself a little bit of uh, sensations that something is changing, right? Um, but if I stay stuck in this potential stage, right? If I just keep researching things and don't act, if I just keep talking about healing and stay stuck in these patterns, nothing changes, because potential never risks failure, right? If I don't really try, then I cannot fail, right? I cannot fail. So I can keep this fantasy idea in my head floating around. Um, so yeah, potential never risks failure. It never risks failure. And as long as your future remains theoretical, right? You never have to confront rejection. You never have to confront imperfection or discomfort or vulnerability. And hell, you don't even have to uh, confront actual change, right? And the brain loves certainty. It loves certainty. I mean, certainty is, who doesn't love certainty? I mean, if there's someone out there listening to this who's like, oh, I love uncertainty, you are so lying to yourself. Like, you are so lying to yourself. No one loves uncertainty. Your nervous system doesn't love it, right? It just doesn't. So, even painful certainty, your brain kind of loves it, which means, people often choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar growth. Wow. Like, think about that for a second. You yourself have a natural inclination to choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar growth. Like, that's huge. That is just something huge to really process for a second. Because what I find is that most people aren't trapped by inability, right? They are trapped by avoidance that's disguised as preparation. And gosh, that's hard, right? That is so hard, that you are trapped by avoidance that is disguised by preparation, right? And I'm not saying that all preparation is bad. Obviously, I'm not, because preparation is so necessary. We need preparation to get started healing, right? We need preparation. I think the biggest thing, and obviously, that could be a whole episode on itself, but when does that fine line between preparation, like when does preparation sort of end, and now it's just sort of like this fear-based avoidance so that we don't have to start acting? And I think that can also be something different for everybody, right? Like, I love to research things, I love to know things, um but I think that, at least for me, sometimes, sure, I can get stuck in that fear-based avoidance. That can totally happen, right? So where does all of this kind of relate to maybe what we call like a trauma identity, right? So if we are, um if no one's coming to save us, right? Where is this trauma identity piece come into? And I think this part is delicate, right? It's really delicate, and I want to respect it as so. But I do feel like it's important, right? Um, I feel like sometimes, we can become deeply identified with being like broken. We can become deeply identified with being traumatized and misunderstood and abandoned and damaged, right? And I am certainly not making anyone's trauma any less of an event, right? I'm just simply saying that sometimes, again, just like what we've talked about with identity before, like if I'm a first responder and all of my identity is surrounded by this one thing that I do, um, that can create quite the imbalance, right? So similarly with, I think, trauma is that we can become so deeply identified, one part of us, that part of us that has been traumatized, that part of us that has been misunderstood and abandoned, right? This is not something, again, we intentionally do, but identity really creates this structure, right? And when suffering becomes identity, phew, healing becomes threatening. It becomes threatening, right? Like if I live my life as someone who has been assaulted, right? There's some protection in that, right? Because one, I'm always vigilant of it. I'm always reminded of how that made me feel and how that affects my life. Um, and so to give up that identity piece or to heal that identity piece, right? That can become quite scary. Um, healing can become threatening because if you're no longer this victim, right? If you are no longer this wounded one or this abandoned one, who are you? Who are you? And that question, I think it really destabilizes people. And it destabilizes people more than they realize, right? So again, this discussion is not about like, blaming people for being a victim or any of that kind of stuff. Like it's not about like reducing the impact that trauma has had on someone's life. It's just simply acknowledging that like, there's still other parts of your identity, right? And we can't necessarily allow one part of our identity or our story to swallow up everything else or to be even larger more times than not, right? Um, and from a neuroscience standpoint, like really identity is reinforced through repetition, right? And we know this, we've talked about this before. Our identity is really reinforced through repetition. So, again, our brain will strengthen pathways that are really like repeatedly activated, right? So, in other words, the more you tell the story of who you are, the more neurologically that story is reinforced. Um, and this is why change feels physically uncomfortable, I think. Um, because you are not just changing behavior, right? If you were just changing behavior, that's one thing, but you are disrupting established neural network patterns that's tied to identity and survival, right? So it is not just changing behavior, it is restructuring. And that's not nothing. That's a big deal. And that's hard, right? That's really hard. So, I want to say something right now, and I got a feeling it's going to be a little controversial as a therapist, right? It's going to be a little controversial, but this show can be a little controversial, and I'm going to say it anyways because it's the truth. And I will die on that hill. Validation is important, okay? Validation is important. Being seen, it matters. Feeling understood matters. But validation alone does not create transformation. Validation alone is not going to create that transformation for you. Being seen is not going to create that transformation from you. And feeling understood, it's not going to create it for you. It's not going to happen. And sometimes, I think we can become emotionally dependent upon being understood instead of feeling responsible for change. Go ahead, blow those comments up. I get it. I get it. Hey, listen, I'm, it's what it is. But I think that when we become emotionally dependent on being understood instead of becoming responsible for our change, that can be dangerous, right? That can be dangerous because insight, really, again, insight, so that awareness that we have, um, without any kind of action really becomes like emotional sedation, right? I'm just taking like a happy pill. I'm just taking a happy pill, right? Because someone's like, oh, it's going to be okay. Like, wow, I can understand that would be really tough. And if that's all we ever hear, right? Um, where's the motivation in that? It's not really there, right? And again, I'm not saying that these validation, support, being understood, not saying it's not important. It is important. Um, but we can't solely rely on that, right? There's a time to be comforted, right? And be reminded that what we are experiencing is very difficult. And then there's really a time that we are surrounded by people that says, man, that's really tough. What do you think you're going to do about that? Right? You can understand your trauma perfectly. And we've talked about that too. And you can still stay stuck in it. I can know something all day long and I can still be stuck, right? You can explain every single pattern you have almost eloquently and in such clear detail, and you can still avoid changing your life. I see it every day. I see it every day. And awareness, again, having awareness of these patterns, that's not the finish line. Awareness of these patterns is not the finish line. It's really the beginning. It's where things start, right? Having insight and awareness to your patterns is the beginning. It's not the end. So I want you guys to listen to this very, very carefully, right? Responsibility is not blame. It's not blame. Those are different things. You are not responsible for what happened to you, right? You're not responsible for the trauma that you experienced, for the neglect that you experienced, and you're not responsible for the betrayal that you experienced. You are not responsible for that, right? But eventually, unfortunately, you become responsible for confronting it, right? For healing it, managing it. Uh, let's see, what else? You become responsible for choosing what happens next, right? That's adulthood. That's adulthood. I kind of explain to some of my clients that I work with is that, us as humans, we are like an onion, right? We're like an onion. And if the core of this onion represents who we are in the present, the layers around this onion, right? The layers are kind of what have contributed. And so we don't look to these layers to place blame, because this is not placing blame, right? I can have a layer of having like a very difficult childhood. I can have a layer of being abandoned. I can have betrayal layers and attachment wound layers, right? And I can know exactly who those people were that did that to us. But blame is different. Blame is different. What we are simply saying is we can acknowledge something without blaming something. And actually that's two different emotions that's being experienced. Blame kind of can come from like anger and sadness. Acknowledgement, now we're kind of shifting into that. I'm going to try to be responsible for some of this, right? I can acknowledge who, what, where, when, how this happened, right? I can acknowledge this, and stay in check of some of those negative emotions, so that, acknowledgement means I can learn. Acknowledgement means I can heal, right? And so, yeah, choosing what happens next, you can do that. That's adulthood. And honestly, that realization is painful. It is painful. Because there's grief in understanding, right? There's a lot of grief in understanding. Um, especially in understanding that nobody can carry your healing for you. They can't. It's not their responsibility. And if we are always, or part of the time, looking at external factors, right? Looking at external factors that is going to be responsible for our healing, we're going to be let down every single time. Like every time we're going to be let down. Guarantee it. Almost every single time. Because people can support you. They can walk beside you. They can love you. They can guide you. But nobody can do the reps inside your own nervous system but you. They can't, right? They can only offer that supplemental. And that's the best that anything external can do for you. And that's a hard reality. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but that is the truth. And you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know the truth about mental health. Because otherwise, what are we talking about? Otherwise, we're just some other kind of stupid show that's just, I don't know, teaching you how to breathe or some shit. Like, what is that? Um, but spit a lot of stuff right now. But let's kind of talk about this. Why does action then just feel so hard? Why does it feel so hard? Well, our brain prefers, again, like we said, familiarity over improvement, right? Because that's pretty important, right? I'm going to say it again. It's so important. The brain prefers familiarity over improvement. And so, your nervous system is constantly asking, like, do I know this? Is this what I know? Is this, it's not asking, is this healthy? It's asking, like, is this familiar? Right? Because that sense of safety is what it craves. It doesn't crave like, oh, this feels scary, but is it healthy? Like, nah, it's not thinking like that, right? And that's why, like, I think sometimes toxic relationships can feel like magnetic, right? That's why, like, self-sabotage can feel automatic. Perhaps that's why procrastination can feel relieving, right? Avoidance feels safer than movement, right? Because action creates uncertainty. And who the hell wants uncertainty? Nobody. Not me. I don't like uncertainty. I like to know what's going on. Shoot, one of my core beliefs is I always have to be in control, right? My negative core belief is I am not in control. And that'd be a little bit of sidebar homework for you, searching up what are negative core beliefs, but we'll stay on track here. We'll stay on track. Yeah, so, uncertainty really, again, it activates threat systems, and that's why growth feels terrifying. And it's not because growth is wrong, it's because your nervous system interprets change as risk, right? And just because it's interpreting it as risk does not make it effing so. All right? It does not make it so. So, what actually changes people? That's a good question. What actually can change you then? Well, I'll tell you, number one, repeated action. Repeated action, not motivation. Repetition. Repetition. Neuroplasticity requires repeated experience. Period. You can challenge me on that. Please do. But neuroplasticity, in other words, rewiring our old behaviors, our old structures, requires repeated experiences, not motivation to just get started one time. Nervous system regulation, right? Biology freaking matters. This is not just fluffy woo-woo hippie stuff. Like, it matters. You breathe for a reason. You should move around for a reason. You should sleep for a reason. Nervous system regulation, breathing, intentionally breathing to take a breath, right? Intentional movement, intentional sleep, right? Intentional grounding, right? Back to that grounding thing. What's grounding? Connecting to something. Connecting to something using your five senses, right? Things you can see, things you can feel, things you can hear, things you can smell, taste, all of those things, right? Connecting to your five senses. Your biology matters. There's a reason why you have your five senses. And it is not just to interpret tangible things, it's also to help regulate your nervous system. That's why you have this stuff. I think a third thing is really some of us really should have, or could have a little more honest self-confrontation with ourselves, right? Not self-hatred, but truth, right? But truth, being like really intentionally self-confrontational, right? Is this avoidance because I'm afraid, or am I really just needing some more information? We don't ask ourselves those intentional questions enough, but we really should. We really should. And if we're going to have some honest self confrontation, we also need some accountability, right? We have to have some accountability. And again, not shame, but some structure. People who help you stay aligned when your emotions fluctuate. People that don't just validate your co-signed bullshit behavior. Oh, it's okay you didn't go to the gym today. You know, you had a hard day. It's okay. You should give yourself a day off. Screw that. Some days you may have had a hard day, but other days, that sentence is just validation for your inaction. Sorry, but it is. It is just validation for your inaction. And, you know, honestly, we have to let go of these rescue fantasies. You know, and this is the big one. This is the big one. The moment you stop waiting, your life changes. The moment you stop waiting, your life is going to change. I promise you it will. Not instantly, right? But fundamentally, it's going to start changing. And because your energy shifts from who will save me, question mark, to what am I going to do next? That's freaking power right there. That is power right there. You know, instead of being like, oh my gosh, who could I ask about this? Screw that. What am I going to do about this? Right? That is taking power away from something that is keeping you powerless. Period. It is keeping you powerless. You know, looking towards these external things. Like, come on. Right? So I want you to think about this right now. Where in your life are you still waiting? You know, and think about that word waiting. Where in your life are you still waiting? Are you waiting for permission? Right? Are you waiting for someone to come and rescue you? Are you waiting for motivation? Are you waiting for certainty? Are you waiting for someone else to finally give you things to fix the pain? Mm. Are you waiting for someone else to give you things to fix this pain and this struggle that you're in? You know, that's some intentional confrontational questions right there, right? That's an intentional confrontational question right there. So guys, I kind of want to leave you with this, right? Like, this has been a hard topic today, and you know, don't hate me. But I'm not going to be just another asshat in your life that doesn't tell you the truth. You need truth, right? Truth is a big deal, because if someone is spitting some truth to you, then you can actually have some information that you can do something with and promote change in your life, right? And I'm not saying you can't have hard days and hard months and hard weeks. You can, and you got to be kind to yourself, right? But you give yourself those breaks that you need, and you give yourself that time, and then you start asking yourself some serious self-confronting questions, right? Has enough time passed? Do I need to get moving? Right? Am I just avoiding now? You got to ask yourself some things, right? And so, you know, again, this episode was really about this idea that nobody is coming to save you. And strangely, that is not to make you feel hopeless. That's freedom. That's freedom. Can you imagine how awesome it would be to start living your life knowing that the power for change is in your own hands? That's amazing. Like, that is like doors are now wide open, right? If change in my life is not related to anything external but everything internal, that's freedom. And because once you stop waiting for someone else to change your life, you finally realize you've had more power than you thought all along. You start realizing that. Not total control and not easy answers, but power. There's a big difference there, right? It's enough to take the next step. It's enough to stop hiding inside of potential. And it's enough to build something different, right? It's enough to build something different. One decision at a time. You can do this, right? No one's coming to save us, and we don't need anybody to. You have it inside of you to do this. You have it inside of you to do this. And it's okay that it's scary, right? But it's one day at a time. It's one decision at a time. And you have the power to change it, right? Thanks so much, guys. This is The Forge.